In the last episode, we spoke about the upcoming e-bikes. Prior to that, we spoke about the upcoming electric cars. So there are a lot of electric bikes and electric cars that are coming our way in this market. Audi has launched the new urban sphere concept. They also have the Audi e-tron, which is this car, and the Audi e-tron GT. Mercedes has the EQS, and there's a new EQS SUV which is going to be launched. BMW has just unveiled their new i7. It's an all-electric 7 series of cars, and it's redesigned. So we have a lot of electric cars coming our way. There are a lot of electric cars being sold in India right now. But do we have the adequate infrastructure to support these electric vehicles? We started this series, which is India's EV revolution, with the Indian infrastructure around electric vehicles as well as electric vehicles in mind. In the first episode of this series, we spoke about the upcoming plans with respect to India's EV infrastructure. In this episode, let's talk about the current infrastructure and what are the shortcomings and why it is a grey area where electric vehicles are concerned, and it does need our attention. The biggest challenge that we have with EV cars is the charging stations. We currently do have 2,763 DC fast chargers in India overall. The number doesn't feel so significant, but with the phase 2 of India's Fame India scheme, it is going to increase by additional 3,000 chargers. So we might have around 5,000 to 6,000 chargers by the end of this year, which does sound promising, but with cars selling up to 4,000 to 7,000 on a yearly basis, and it's going to be increasing by 600% as per what we have seen in the last few years, those are not going to be enough. That being said, we can still charge these cars at home, but even the infrastructure that we currently have, even in our residential zones, is not that enough, because buildings are not adapting to the overall EV infrastructure that soon. For instance, currently the appliances that are powered in a house are charged by around 240 volts. We do get a charger with EV cars which bumps it up to 240 volts when we need to charge these cars. So a 240 volt charge, that's an AC charger, will charge this car in about 8 to 9 hours. That's an overnight charging. But if you do want to charge the car on the go, like you need it in maybe 30 minutes or an hour, you need a DC power station to charge these cars. Those are not that freely available even right now. You have to fight for your ports. And with the number of cars or sales of these cars increasing year on year at such a rapid pace, you might just find waiting lines even at these DC power stations. And that waiting line is not going to be resolved very quickly. It's because to charge one car, you'll at least need a minimum of 1 hour. So multiple ports at any given point in time at a DC power charging station for these EV cars is going to be important. Right now, there's not much thought being put into place for the same. The second biggest issue that we are currently facing is with respect to the charging ports. Now, it's not really a part of the infrastructure, but it does relate, is because if you have a charging station dedicated to one manufacturer, it does occupy space. But if that space can be shared by multiple manufacturers at the same time, you're able to cater to a wider audience with one single slot available. That's not happening right now because different manufacturers tend to use different manufacturing or their own standardized ports, because of which, like for instance, I can charge this Audi or the Audi e-tron at an Audi's power station at a very faster speed. But if I had to take maybe Tata Nexon, I would not be able to do that. I'll need an application from Audi, and that will not allow me. It's because I don't own an Audi at that point in time. I own a Tata Nexon EV. But in the similar way, if I do own an Audi, but at the same time I have a Tesla, I will not be able to use the same charger for either of these cars. I'll have to have their own proprietary chargers, and that creates an issue. Instance, our mobile phones right now are standardizing a Type-C port, because of which you're able to charge the phone, you're able to charge your tab. Even Apple's iPads have Type-C right now, because of which one charging cable is good enough to carry for your multiple devices. Imagine the same scenario for your electric cars. One charging station can charge multiple brands. That will be very important, especially when you're focusing on developing India's overall infrastructure around EVs. The third biggest problem that we're going to face with the infrastructure is the electrical grid. If you think about transferring the whole national fleet of vehicles into electric, that is going to put an immense amount of stress on the current electric grid. So we do need to think about how to upgrade it. Just to give you an example, अगर ये गाड़ी में एक घर पे जाके एक पावर स्टेशन जैसा यूज करता हूँ, तो मेरा घर इस गाड़ी के पावर पे एटलीस्ट 3 दिन चलेगा. Just to give you an insight, that's a huge amount of electricity that this car needs to drive me around 400 kilometers of range. I have 2 ACs at home. There are multiple fans, there are lights that are going to be used, there's a refrigerator that's in use, and there's the washing machine that frequently gets used. So if I factor that in, and if I'm still able to use my house for 2 whole days or maximum 3 days by just one car, just imagine the amount of electricity that the car uses. सोचने वाली बात है, right? The fourth point is space. हाँ, हम जगह के बारे में सोचते नहीं, मगर ये गाड़ी बहुत बड़ी है यार. अगर किधर पार्क करनी तो जगह तो लगती है, और अगर चार्ज करने में टाइम लगने वाला है, ताकि 1 घंटा है, तो जगह तो लगेगी. और जैसे ये गाड़ी बिक रही है तो यार बहुत ही ज़्यादा जगह लगने वाली है, because there is a subsidized cost that we are getting currently on these vehicles as compared to the other cars. There is no green tax. So these are expensive, but you end on saving money a lot. और आज हम निकले थे गाड़ी का शूट करने के लिए, तो सोचा चलो आज ईवी कार्स कितने हैं वो काउंट करते हैं. हम 3 घंटे से बाहर है, और 3 घंटे में एटलीस्ट हम लोगों ने 6 इलेक्ट्रिक बाइक्स देखी है, और 5-6 से अनदर इलेक्ट्रिक कार्स भी देखी है. So yeah, that is proof in itself that a lot of these cars are selling. But tomorrow, if we need to charge these cars at DC power stations, we will need not just the power stations, but also adequate space, because obviously we'll be installing multiple power stations, and each of these cars will require at least a minimum of 1 hour to charge. So that rotational time is not as easy as when you take an IC car to just fuel up at a petrol station. That's also very important for the government to factor this in and allocate places so that, you know, these cars can be safely parked and charged, because it is not proven, but it's quite dangerous if these cars catch fires, and if you have a fleet of these cars sticking next to each other, that's going to be one mess nobody wants to get into or even take responsibility for. Now, the fifth point that I'm going to talk about is related to the fourth one, but not directly related, but indirectly. It sounds stupid, but that's how it is. It's related to the space. Now, the space that I spoke about is allocating that space, but a lot of this space that is currently around is also owned by people privately or by organizations. There is a reason why these people are not leasing out or investing on these plots right now, is because the infrastructure for setting up a DC fast charging station is expensive. It's not really that cheap to set up the whole place. Like this space, for example, can you see how huge this space is? This could have well been used for setting up DC power charger stations around this place, and every office car that comes in this area can come and charge here. But that place is not being used because there are currently no plans by government, or there are no subsidized plans by governments currently available where any of these people, may it be people who own private piece of lands or people who entrepreneurially or organizations that own piece of lands, can invest in this. If there were subsidized plans available, I'm pretty sure a lot of people would invest, because like I mentioned earlier, setting it up is expensive, and since these power grids use high voltages, they have to be managed really, really well. So we don't see that happening right now. And a lot of the spaces that can be used for these cars is not being used. So maybe in the phase 3 of India's FAME scheme, we might see that happening. And the faster it happens, it's important, because the number of cars or number of EV cars on the road is growing exponentially. Now, these are some of the issues that we have with the current infrastructure around electric vehicles in India. And the issues, if not addressed at a rapid pace, the problems are going to grow for electric vehicles. This is Aurelius from Mashable India. And if you like what we are doing, do like and subscribe. And if there's anything in particular that you guys would like us to cover, do leave us a comment. Have a good evening ahead.